Today, we're going over one of the most epic historical clapbacks in modern politics. When Donald Trump boasted that America saved Europe from speaking German, King Charles politely reminded him, "Without us, you would be speaking French." As a German auditor looking at this geopolitical dispute, I can confirm both leaders are fundamentally misunderstanding the spreadsheet. Today, we decode the 1754 war to expose a harsh truth. The British salvation of America was actually the most catastrophic financial collapse in imperial history. Let's open the ledger to the mid-18th century. Modern Americans look at their map and assume their expansion across the continent was an inevitable, unstoppable destiny. Forget manifest destiny. That is a 19th century marketing slogan. In 1750, the 13 British colonies were not a continental superpower. They were a narrow, overcrowded strip of land pinned against the Atlantic Ocean. You were trapped. And who trapped you? The French Empire. France controlled a massive, continuous arc of territory from the freezing forests of Canada, down the Ohio River Valley, all the way to the swamps of Louisiana. They built a highly coordinated chain of steel and timber fortresses that completely locked the British colonists out of the continent's interior. Geopolitically, America was on the verge of being completely cornered and neutralized. If we compare the military doctrines of the era, the disparity is embarrassing for the English speakers. The French were highly adaptable. They abandoned rigid European formations, integrated deeply with powerful Native American confederacies, and mastered intense, asymmetric guerrilla warfare. They fought like ghosts in the woods. Meanwhile, the British command stubbornly clung to bright red coats, marching in straight lines through dense forests. The American colonial militias, on the other hand, were largely disorganized, underfunded, and hopelessly outmatched. If this trajectory had continued unabated, the United States would not exist. Boston and New York would have eventually become isolated, struggling outposts, and the primary language of the North American continent would undoubtedly be French. So, who triggered the global conflict that saved the English language in America? It wasn't a master strategist in London. It was a 22-year-old, highly inexperienced American militia officer named George Washington. In 1754, in a damp Pennsylvania forest, Washington's unit ambushed a French patrol at a place called Jumonville Glen. That single, chaotic skirmish lit the powder keg for the 7 Years' War, which was, in reality, the very first global conflict. But before we reach the financial ruin, we must understand the sheer tactical humiliation the British endured. Let's look at the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. General Edward Braddock marched a massive, heavily armed British column right into the dense Pennsylvania woods. He treated the untamed wilderness like a polite European chessboard. Braddock insisted on moving heavy artillery and slow siege wagons through unpaved forest trails. I will let the tactical historians in the comments explain exactly why firing rigid, linear volleys against a dispersed, camouflaged enemy in a dense forest is a mathematical death sentence. The result was an absolute slaughter. Over 800 British soldiers were systematically dismantled by a much smaller force of French Marines and native warriors who fought like shadows. The invincible British army broke and ran in sheer panic. This disaster proved something dangerous to the American colonists. It proved that the vaunted British redcoats, who demanded absolute obedience and sneered at colonial tactics, were not invincible. In the woods, European arrogance was a fatal liability. The colonials learned that to survive, you don't stand in a straight line, you adapt, and you become ruthless. This was not just a military defeat, it was the psychological shattering of British supremacy. To prevent their colonies from being completely erased, the British Empire had to initiate a massive military bailout. Let us be specific about the scale of this logistical miracle. Prime Minister William Pitt essentially wrote a blank check, mobilizing over 20,000 highly trained regular troops and deploying the full might of the Royal Navy to blockade the French coast, all to ensure American survival. It culminated in 1759 at the Plains of Abraham, where the British military machine finally broke the back of French power. The American colonial militias actually fought with incredible grit, enduring staggering losses to protect their homes. Yet, the aristocratic British officers viewed them with absolute contempt, treating them like uneducated country peasants. The British regulars took all the tactical glory, leaving the American militias feeling deeply disrespected. This elite arrogance planted the very first, quiet seeds of internal hatred. Let us pivot from the battlefield to the German economic perspective. The British Empire won the war and secured the continent for the English language. But at what cost? Their financial spreadsheet completely imploded. London had spent an astronomical sum to deploy forces, supply logistics, and physically secure the borders of North America. Let us look at the exact receipts. Before the war, the British national debt was roughly £74 million. By the time they finished securing the American frontier in 1763, that debt had exploded to an unsustainable £133 million. The interest payments alone were paralyzing the empire. And how did London try to balance this spreadsheet? They introduced the Stamp Act of 1765. They asked the colonists to pay a microscopic fraction of the defense budget, literally pennies on legal documents and newspapers, to maintain a standing army of 10,000 men that was still actively protecting the American borders from native retaliations. Objectively, it was one of the most generous defense subsidies in human history. Yet, they essentially bankrupted their own global treasury to save the 13 colonies from French dominion. So what happened next is the greatest financial bait-and-switch in geopolitical history. After saving their colonial subjects, the British Parliament politely asked the Americans to pay this highly subsidized, fractional tax to help cover the massive debt of the war that literally saved their existence. How did the Americans respond to this invoice? They threw British tea into the harbor, loudly branded the taxation as tyranny, and launched the American Revolution. American history books romanticize this as a noble, ideological struggle for liberty and democratic representation. But if you look at the cold, hard economic audit, American patriotism was fundamentally ignited by a fierce refusal to pay their military defense bill. They let the British Empire drain its treasury to zero to remove the French threat, and the exact moment the invoice arrived, they declared independence. By eliminating the French, the British made a fatal strategic error. They removed the only geopolitical threat that kept the Americans dependent on London for protection. Without the French breathing down their necks, the Americans simply didn't need the British military anymore. One has to look at the map and wonder. If France had retained its massive territory, holding the line at the Ohio River, could a divided, bilingual North America have ever become the unified global superpower it is today? Of course, history is complex. A century and a half later, America would cross the Atlantic to secure Europe in World War II, paying an immense physical toll. If your family sacrificed on the beaches of Normandy or in the Ardennes forest, honor their division in the comments below so their legacy is permanently recorded. So, here is the final German verdict. King Charles is tactically correct, but strategically blind. The British Empire did save America from speaking French, but in doing so, they engineered their own economic self-sabotage and funded their own replacement. My forensic question to you: was the birth of the United States the result of a grand ideological vision for freedom, or simply a spectacular, calculated evasion of imperial debt? Drop your verdict below and subscribe to the WarSim.